So usually, when we try to understand a massive political realignment, we kind of look for something really obvious.
Right, like a smoking gun.
Exactly, yeah. We treat history like this, like a geological event. We wait for the tectonic plates to violently shift, or the ground to split open, a huge scandal to break, or maybe a major piece of legislation completely
And we
collapsing.
want the pundits to be able to point at a chart and just say, there, right there. That was the day the whole world changed.
Yeah, because it's a very human impulse, right? We crave those clean narratives, a rupture, a reaction, a brand new reality.
It makes the world easier to digest.
Totally. But then, you step into the actual messy, lived-in world of American political identity. And specifically, if you look at the shifting allegiances of rural voters right now, as we head into the 2026 midterms, well, suddenly, there are no clean breaks.
Oh, not at all.
There are no obvious fault lines. We are looking at a landscape that is just deeply, deeply contradictory.
It really is. It's an environment where the traditional laws of political gravity, they just don't seem to apply anymore. I mean, the data says one thing, the culture says another, and the actual human beings on the ground are kind of caught somewhere in the middle of all that friction.
Right. So welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are taking you right into rural Ohio. We're examining this really unexpected battleground where missing baseball hats, completely idle electric vehicle factories, isolated sheep farms, and even the cascading domestic trauma of overseas conflicts might all be signaling a fundamental collapse of a major political coalition.
No, and this is where it gets incredibly complicated. Those exact same data points might actually prove that the coalition is more unbreakable than ever.
Yeah, which is exactly what makes this specific moment in time so challenging to decode.
Wow.
We're essentially looking at the exact same set of facts through two completely incompatible lenses.
Right, two entirely different realities.
Exactly. And to do that, we are pulling from a really fascinating stack of sources today. On one side, we have this highly polished, mainstream, boots-on-the-ground investigative report from CNN.
Very traditional journalism.
Right.
Yeah.
They sent a crew deep into Ohio to ask a very straightforward question. Is the NGA coalition cracking? They're looking at kitchen table economic metrics. They're interviewing local union bosses, talking to farmers, sitting down with veterans.
Yeah. And then paired against that, we have a radically different piece of source material.
Radically different.
We are analyzing a raw, totally unedited reaction stream from a prominent, highly opinionated left-wing YouTube commentator named Vaush.
Yeah, and he is watching this exact same CNN report live with his audience, right?
He is, yeah. But he is analyzing the voters, the state politicians, the underlying sociology, all through a fiercely critical, very progressive, and frankly, highly cynical framework.
So before we jump into the mechanics of this, I want to be really clear with you, the listener, about what we're actually doing here. We're looking at two wildly different, highly polarized sources today.
It's very polarized.
The CNN report is capturing this raw local frustration, and the Vaush stream is, it's aggressive, it's controversial, it is steeped in intense left-wing critique. Our job today is not to take a side.
Definitely not.
We aren't endorsing CNN's traditional economic theories, and we certainly aren't validating Vaush's aggressive framing of these voters.
No, our mission is purely analytical. We want to put these two competing realities under the microscope, kind of reverse engineer their logic, and figure out what makes these arguments tick.
Exactly. We're looking at the architecture of the beliefs, not judging the people who hold them.
That's the goal.
So here is how we're going to navigate this today. We're going to start with the strange visual disappearance of political merchandise in Ohio. From there, we'll dive into the brutal microeconomics of local factory towns to see how global tariffs actually impact a single zip code.
The real on-the-ground impact.
Right. Then we'll explore how the geopolitical shockwaves of the quote-unquote Iran war are reshaping rural psychology. And finally, we're going to break down the deeply fascinating, highly contentious theories about why a community might passionately vote against its own economic spreadsheet.
It really is a journey from the surface-level optics all the way down to the absolute bedrock of cultural identity.
Right. Because to understand an earthquake, you first have to look for the tremors. So let's start with the most visible, tangible symbol of American politics over the last decade.
The red hat.
The red hat. The visual geography of the Mahoning Valley. So the CNN report takes us first into Mahoning County, Ohio. Now, for the listener who Maybe doesn't know the deep history of this specific area. For decades, this was gritty, blue-collar, reliably Democratic, union card-carrying territory.
It was the absolute firewall for the Democratic Party in the Midwest.
Yeah, but over the last few election cycles, it transformed completely. It became a deep red stronghold.
It was sort of the ultimate proof of concept for the new populist coalition, just a complete rewiring of the working class vote.
Exactly. But CNN sits down with a guy named Chris Anderson. He's the Mahoning County Democratic chairman. And Anderson points out a shift that he believes is just monumental.
What did he notice?
Well, he tells the reporter that for the last 8 years, there were political signs hammered into every single street corner. There were massive flags hanging off the back of pickup trucks. He says you literally could not walk into a local grocery store without seeing 3 or 4 people wearing those bright red Meiji hats.
It was an overwhelming visual monopoly.
Right. And now
Okay.
Anderson challenges the CNN reporters to find even one.
Really? Just completely gone.
He says they're just gone. The hats have vanished from the diners. The flags have come down from the porches. And Anderson is making this massive, high-stakes political wager based entirely on this optical absence.
He thinks it means they flipped.
He does. He believes this visual shift translates directly to a behavioral shift at the ballot box. He is betting that these voters feel burned, that the manufacturing renaissance they were promised never actually materialized, and that this missing merchandise means the Democrats have a legitimate path to win a Senate seat and elect Ohio's first Democratic governor in 15 years.
Wow. Let's really look at the mechanics of Anderson's logic here, because it perfectly represents the standard playbook of traditional political science.
How so?
Well, Anderson is operating on a hypothesis of direct causality. The logic goes. Enthusiasm was high because economic promises were made. The economic promises were broken. Therefore, enthusiasm dropped. Therefore, the merchandise disappeared. Therefore, the votes will flip back.
It's a very clean, rational, linear equation.
Exactly. It's incredibly linear.
It makes sense on paper, you know? I've been trying to find a real-world equivalent for this. Like, is it like a sports team?
Yeah.
Imagine your city has a football team, and the fans are absolutely rabid. They wear the jerseys to the grocery store, they paint their faces, put bumper stickers on their cars.
Sure, the diehards.
Right. But then the team goes on a horrific, 5-year losing streak. The management trades away all the good players. The jerseys go into the back of the closet. The bumper stickers get scraped off. The visual enthusiasm dies.
And that's Anderson's view. The fans are abandoning the team.
Right. But my question is, are they actually abandoning the team, or are they just retreating to their living rooms, sitting on the couch, and quietly watching every single game on Sunday anyway?
That is a great distinction.
Like, are the hats gone because the core loyalty is broken, or is the loud public performance of that loyalty just taking a break?
And that right there is the exact tension that Vaush introduces when he analyzes the CNN segment.
He hates the Anderson theory, right?
He absolutely tears it apart. Vaush watches Chris Anderson make this grand prediction about the midterms, and Vaush completely viscerally rejects the entire premise.
He doesn't just disagree with the conclusion.
Yeah.
He disagrees with the entire foundation of why these voters flipped in the first place.
Precisely. This is a crucial divergence in how we understand modern political momentum. CNN, and by extension Chris Anderson, they implicitly frame the initial political shift of the Mahoning Valley as an economic transaction.
Yeah, the idea that these voters wanted union jobs, they felt ignored by the globalist trade policies of the Obama era.
Right. They were promised a rigid protectionist manufacturing revival, so they voted for it. And now the jobs aren't there, so they might vote against it.
Transactional politics. I vote for you, you give me a factory.
Exactly. But from Vaush's perspective on the progressive left, he asserts that this entire transactional narrative is a media-invented myth. He argues flat out that these voters did not abandon the Democratic Party for legitimate, rational, economic reasons in the first place.
He is incredibly blunt about this. I mean, he doesn't mince words at all.
No, he doesn't hold back. Vaush argues that this specific coalition was built almost entirely on cultural grievance. He points to anti-immigrant sentiment, deep-seated spite, and what he explicitly calls racial animus. Yeah. And his logic is devastatingly simple. He says if a voter's primary motivation for joining a movement was cultural anger and racial resentment, you cannot suddenly expect them to behave like a rational, spreadsheet-driven economic actor who will politely switch back to the Democrats just because a local factory closed down.
I mean, I want to push back on Vaush's absolute certainty here, because human beings are rarely motivated by just one pure emotion, right? whether that's pure economic anxiety or pure racial animus. It's usually a messy mix.
That's true. It's really that simple.
And to explore this friction, Vaush actually brings in some outside context during his stream.
Hmm.
He pulls up a recent deep dive piece into voter opinions, highlighting specific quotes from individuals who actually seem to be experiencing genuine buyer's remorse. And their reasons are fascinating.
Right. He references a New York Times voter panel to try and crack open this psychology.
Yeah, let's look at those specific voters. He mentions a 51-year-old white Republican portfolio manager. Now, this guy originally voted for the incumbent because he agreed with the core promise to secure the border and fix immigration. He was completely on board with the policy objective.
Okay, so a policy-driven vote?
Exactly. But then he watched the actual implementation. He saw the news reports about how ICE was treating people on the ground, the family separations, the conditions of the holding facilities. And this portfolio manager recoiled. He said, quote, "This was not the way to do it."
So his defection isn't based on economics at all. It's based on a moral boundary regarding state power?
Exactly. And then there is this second quote, which is from Jose, a Latino independent voter. Jose's original rationale for his vote was heavily based on what we could call a character arc.
A character arc.
Yeah. He thought the president, despite his flaws, would get into the Oval Office, feel the immense weight of the presidency, quote, learn from his mistakes, and basically transform into a stellar, unifying leader.
The pivot theory. The idea that the office makes the man.
Right. But now, years later, Jose describes the reality of the presidency as horror movie. He admits he was entirely, completely wrong to cast that vote. So CNN looks at people like Jose and the portfolio manager, and they say, see, the coalition is fracturing. The Democrats just have to walk through the open door.
But Vaush doesn't buy that.
Not at all. Vaush looks at these exact same people and arrives at a deeply pessimistic conclusion about the fundamental mechanics of political power. And this is where he introduces this concept of the charisma void.
Yes. If we really want to understand the psychological architecture of this era, the charisma void is perhaps Vaush's most compelling and arguably most disturbing theoretical framework.
Break that down for me. What does he actually mean by a void?
So Vaush argues that the central figure of this populist movement is not actually a traditional politician with a rigid ideology. Instead, he describes the leader as essentially an empty vessel, a void that is incredibly loud but philosophically hollow. Yeah, and because it's a void, voters can project whatever they want into it. A union worker can project a manufacturing revival. A portfolio manager can project border security. Someone like Jose can project a redemption arc.
So they aren't voting for the reality of the person. They're voting for their own customized hologram of the person.
Precisely. Vaush argues that voters don't gravitate to this leader for pragmatic reasons or specific white paper policy goals or even out of pure calculated self-interest. They gravitate to him simply because he is the loudest, most entertaining, most dominant person in the room.
It's all about the show.
Yes, he is a charismatic character operating in a media landscape where almost no one else possesses any actual charisma.
And this leads Vaush into a completely blistering critique of the Democratic Party, which is interesting coming from his own side of the aisle.
It is a scathing indictment. He labels the Democrats as technocrats.
Okay, let's pause here.
Yeah.
Define technocrat in this specific context. Because usually, being a technocrat, someone who understands the technical details, the data, the science of governance, that's framed as a positive thing.
In a functioning, purely rational society, yes, it would be. But Vaush is arguing we do not live in a purely rational society. He uses technocrat as a pejorative.
Like an insult.
Exactly. He means a politician who treats governance like a dreary administrative obligation, like a chore. Someone who gets behind a podium, adjusts their glasses, and reads off a 40-point plan to incrementally adjust the marginal tax rate to fund a specific infrastructure block grant.
And Vaush is saying nobody cares.
He is saying that Democrats fundamentally misunderstand the nature of modern political warfare. They lack what he calls a love of the game.
Oh, love of the game.
Right. In his view, you cannot defeat a loud, aggressively charismatic, entertainment-driven movement with quiet, spreadsheet-driven technocracy. It is a knife fight, and the Democrats are bringing a calculator. They fail, according to Vaush, because they simply cannot compete on noise.
Think about your own life for a second. Have you ever been in a meeting at your company, or maybe a local school board meeting? Someone stands up with a brilliant, incredibly well-researched, meticulously data-driven proposal. They've done all the math. They are the ultimate technocrat.
But they're a little boring.
Right. They are a little dry.
Right.
And then the next person stands up. Their plan has massive, obvious holes in it. The math does not add up at all. But they speak with absolute unshakable confidence. They tell a great story. They make the room laugh. Who wins that meeting?
The storyteller almost every time.
Have you noticed how the sheer volume and confidence of a message so consistently outcompetes the actual substance of a message?
It's an uncomfortable reality about human psychology. We are biologically drawn to confidence, dominance, and narrative far more than we are drawn to statistics, caveats, and complex structural reforms.
And Vaush thinks that's what's happening in Ohio.
He argues that this psychological reality is the dominant, defining force in rural Ohio. He believes that relying on these voters to calmly, rationally analyze their local economic decay and subsequently switch their political allegiance is just a total fool's errand. The hats might be missing, but the underlying craving for that loud, chaotic charisma hasn't gone anywhere.
But, CNN is determined to test that theory against hard physical reality. Because if charisma is the glue holding this whole thing together, what happens when the actual concrete foundation of these communities starts to cave in?
When the money dries up.
Exactly. I want to transition here from the abstract psychology of political loyalty down to the cold, hard floors of the factories. Let's look at the mechanics of broken promises in Lordstown, Ohio.
This is where the macroeconomic theory collides with microeconomic devastation.
So the CNN crew drives into Lordstown, and they focus on Local 1112 of the United Auto Workers. Now, Lordstown is effectively ground zero for the national debate about the American working class. For 50 years, General Motors made cars here.
The Chevy Cruze, right.
Yeah, exactly. We are talking about thousands of highly paid, deeply secure generational union jobs. It was the beating heart of the local economy. But then, in 2019, General Motors closed the plant.
And we have to remember the intense political context of that closure. That plant was shuttered despite highly publicized, direct promises made during the first term of the administration that this specific facility would remain open and thriving. The political blowback was massive.
It was a huge betrayal. But the narrative didn't end with the closure. There were frantic attempts at an industrial revival to save face. Foxconn, the massive Taiwanese electronics manufacturer, eventually bought the old GM site.
Right.
They built a new factory. But, and this is a catastrophic detail for the UAW voters, that new workforce was completely non-union. The wages were different, the protections were gone. And to make matters worse, currently, that Foxconn factory is sitting mostly idle as the company tries to figure out its actual production strategy.
So the initial promise of a one-to-one replacement of the GM jobs evaporated immediately. But there was a second lifeline, wasn't there?
Right, the beacon of the future, Ultium Cells. This is supposed to be the great green transition, a massive multi-billion-dollar joint venture between General Motors and LG Electronics to build electric vehicle batteries right there in Lordstown.
Sounds like a huge win.
It sounded like it. CNN tracks down a guy named Bob Swagger. He's a leader of the campaign committee at Local 1112. And the reporter asks him a very simple question. How many guys are working in that battery factory right now? And Swagger's answer is just brutally stark.
He tells the reporter that all production is completely shut down. 1,460 workers. They were all laid off on the morning of January 5th.
Just a layoff.
Yep. And the absolute worst part is the uncertainty. They have no timeline. They have absolutely no idea when or if they are ever coming back to the assembly line.
I want to pause and just think about the sheer municipal gravity of 1,460 people losing their paychecks on a single Tuesday in January. Imagine the cascade effect of that through a mid-sized local economy.
It touches everything.
It's not just the workers. It's the diners where they buy lunch. It's the local hardware store. It's the mechanics. It's the property tax revenue that funds the local elementary school. When 4,460 jobs vanish in a place like Lordstown, the whole town physically shudders. And Swagger doesn't just stop at Lordstown. He points out the macro data, too.
Yes, he notes that overall manufacturing employment across the board is actually down by 80,000 jobs since the current administration returned to the White House. Auto manufacturing alone has lost 25,000 jobs in the second term.
Now, I need you to explain the mechanics of this, because this creates a severe cognitive dissonance for these voters. Swagger points out that the UAW actually endorsed the president's massive tariff policies. They supported the trade war. Walk me through the logic there. Why did the union want the tariffs?
Well, the theoretical mechanism of a tariff is supposed to be a shield for domestic labor. The logic goes like this. If the government slaps a 50% or 100% tax on electric vehicle batteries coming in from China or Mexico, it makes those foreign batteries artificially expensive.
Right, so you price them out.
Therefore, auto manufacturers like GM will be forced to buy their batteries from domestic plants, like Ultium Cells in Lordstown, because it's cheaper. The union backed this macroeconomic policy because it was sold to them as an impenetrable wall that would protect their jobs and force a manufacturing renaissance.
But the CNN reporter asks Swagger, flat out, did the tariffs work? And Swagger replies, quote, not that I'm aware of. So the wall failed. The macroeconomic narrative collided violently with the microeconomic reality of those 1,460 people standing in the cold on January 5th.
It's a total disconnect.
Now, CNN frames this entire sequence as the ultimate proof that the MeLoRidAI coalition is built on sand. They argue that you cannot sustain a political movement when the core economic promises fail this spectacularly in your own backyard. But Vaush watches this Lordstown segment, and his reaction is entirely counterintuitive. He essentially looks at the camera and says, why are we even talking about this town?
Vaish's critique here is sharply analytical, and it strips away all the romance of the Rust Belt. He focuses purely on scale, proportion, and statistical reality.
Yeah, he gets into the numbers.
He argues that it is fundamentally irrational for any president to stand at a podium and promise that one specific factory in one specific town will stay open. The global supply chain is simply too complex for a president to micromanage a single battery plant.
And he also attacks the media's obsession with it.
Exactly. He believes it is equally irrational for CNN to treat this single factory as a bellwether for the entire national economy. Vaush makes a really provocative, almost sarcastic comparison to hammer this point home.
The barista joke.
Yes. He points out that the actual employment numbers in these highly contested auto plants, 1,400 people here, 2,000 people there, are statistically microscopic compared to the broader United States workforce. He jokes that while he doesn't know the exact number of baristas working in America, it is unquestionably vastly higher than the number of people working in these specific legacy manufacturing plants.
Okay, I have to stop here and play devil's advocate. Because mathematically, Vaush is right. The service sector dwarfs manufacturing. But politically, I think his barista analogy misses something profound about the American psyche.
What do you mean?
Well, why does an entire national political narrative hinge on a single factory in Lordstown? If the statistical impact on the U.S. GDP is effectively a rounding error, why do we care so deeply about 4,460 auto workers, but we barely blink when 14,000 retail workers lose their jobs because a massive mall goes bankrupt? A job is a job, right? A mortgage needs to be paid either way. Why the obsession with the factory?
This touches on something deeply ingrained in sociology. To understand this, we have to look at what academics call the semiotics of labor.
Break that down for me. What is semiotics and how does it apply to a guy building a car?
Semiotics is the study of signs, symbols, and how meaning is created and communicated in a culture. When we talk about the semiotics of labor, we are talking about the hidden cultural meaning attached to certain types of work. Vaush touches on this when he compares the Lordstown auto workers to the fracking industry in Pennsylvania or the coal miners in West Virginia. He argues that the attachment to these legacy industries isn't actually about the economics. It is almost entirely emotional and symbolic.
It's the mythology of the American worker.
Precisely. For a century, the image of the hard hat, the steel-toed boots, the lunch pail, the sparks flying off an assembly line, these aren't just jobs. They are symbols of American muscle, self-reliance, and masculine breadwinning. Making a physical object out of steel carries a profound cultural weight.
It's the romance of the tangible. A barista makes a latte, which takes 2 minutes, is consumed in 10 minutes, and is gone. It's a service. An auto worker makes an F-150 truck. It's 2 tons of steel. It lasts 20 years. It's a symbol of freedom. Even if there are 100 times more baristas struggling to pay their rent, the cultural gravity of the auto worker is infinitely heavier.
And Vaush's core argument is that modern populist politicians are master manipulators of this specific semiology. They exploit this emotional attachment.
Yeah, they use it.
They travel to Lordstown and wage these massive theatrical symbolic wars over a single factory, not because saving 1,400 jobs will actually change the national inflation rate, but because fighting for that factory proves to the voter that they are fighting for the idea of the traditional American working class. They are defending the symbol even if they can't save the actual jobs.
And if Vaush's theory about the charisma void is right, the voters don't actually need the factory to open. They just need the politician to angrily yell at the people who closed it.
That is the grim conclusion of his framework. The fight itself is the product being delivered.
So we have the bizarre optics of the disappearing hats. We have the crushing microeconomics and the symbolic warfare of the idle factories. But then the CNN report introduces a completely different, highly volatile variable into this rural Ohio ecosystem.
A completely new factor.
Yeah, it's not just the rust on the factory gates that is making these voters anxious. It turns out an external shock, a geopolitical conflict thousands of miles away, is cascading down into these communities, hitting them right in their wallets, and for some, right in their darkest psychological trauma.
We are talking about the profound domestic ripples of what both sources refer to as the ongoing Iran war.
Let's see how a global shockwave hits a local zip code. CNN drives further south, down into the rolling hills of Albany, in the southeast part of Ohio, and they profile a farmer named Bill Krusling. The visual details CNN captures here are incredibly striking. He's out there on 100 grassy acres. He has a flock of about 400 sheep.
That's a lot of sheep.
And they are right in the middle of lambing season. So he's got roughly 200 to 250 pregnant sheep that could give birth at literally any moment. He's totally isolated. He even jokes to the reporter that his only supervisors are the chickens wandering around the barn.
It's a portrait of intense, almost aggressive self-reliance. And what's crucial to understand is that his physical isolation perfectly mirrors his economic isolation.
Walk me through that. How is a sheep farmer isolated from the economy?
Well, Kressling explains to CNN that because of the specific way his farm operates, it's highly localized, pasture-based farming. He doesn't require massive amounts of industrial diesel fuel to run heavy combines, and he doesn't use imported chemical fertilizers to force his grass to grow.
Oh,
Because he is disconnected from those specific global supply chains, he is entirely shielded from the massive price spikes that the reporters call the Iran war cuff spikes that are currently devastating the profit margins of traditional row crop farmers in the Midwest who rely heavily on that diesel and fertilizer.
So the geopolitical tectonic plates are shifting, the cost of oil is exploding because of the war, but Kressling is just standing in his field entirely untouched by the inflation.
Untouched by that specific inflation. But he isn't shielded from the domestic failures of the system. While he avoids the geopolitical shock, he reveals to CNN that he is currently burdened by massive, crushing medical debt, the kind of debt that threatens the entire legacy of his farm.
Right. And this is where Krussling's political psychology becomes incredibly illuminating. The CNN reporter presses him on this. Krusling openly admits that the president came into office promising to completely overhaul and fix the healthcare system, and he hasn't. He admits that the president promised to drastically reduce the national debt, and he hasn't.
Two huge, broken promises.
Krusling has these absolute, undeniable failures of policy staring him right in the face every time he opens a medical bill. But when the reporter asks him who he holds responsible, Krusling says, "I don't blame Trump. I blame the Congress."
This exchange is arguably the most important moment in the entire CNN report because it perfectly, seamlessly validates the core premise of Vaush's left-wing critique.
It really does. Krusling tells the reporter that he is furious at both political parties for being useless, but he's going to vote Republican anyway in the midterms, and his reasoning has absolutely nothing to do with healthcare policy. He says, with a huge smile on his face, that he's voting for the president because the president, quote, loves a fight.
He loves the conflict.
He loves that the leader of the country pushes back against what he dismissively calls pearl clutchers.
What we are witnessing here is the complete, total decoupling of policy outcomes from political loyalty. Krusling readily acknowledges the complete failure of the technocratic promises. The spreadsheet is broken, but to Krusling, those metrics simply don't matter.
Not at all.
What matters is the posture, the attitude, the emotional resonance of feeling like you have a brawler in your corner. Vaush argued 20 minutes earlier in his stream that this entire coalition is held together by the loudest voice and the most aggressive posture, and here is Bill Krusling standing in a sheep pasture, essentially confirming that theory on national television.
He doesn't want a healthcare plan. He wants a gladiator. But then CNN drives even further south, all the way down to Portsmouth in Scioto County. Now, to set the scene, this is deep, deep red territory. The incumbent won 74% of the vote here in the 2024 election. It is the heart of the Mejia base.
Very conservative area.
Very. But in Portsmouth, they meet a guy named Dale King. And Dale King represents a completely different, incredibly raw psychological reaction to the exact same geopolitical shockwaves.
King is a local small business owner. He runs a gym, but the defining characteristic for this context is that he is a combat veteran. He returned home from 2 brutal tours in Iraq roughly 16 years ago.
And his environment reflects that. His office at the gym is just covered in military mementos, medals, flags, unit patches. And the CNN camera crew notes that simply gesturing to these items, just talking about that era of his life, stirs up intense, visible emotion in King.
It's still very fresh for him.
He tells a reporter, quote, "It's crazy. It's 20 years ago, and then we're dealing with Iran." He describes a highly specific psychological phenomenon. He says that guys in his unit have spent 2 decades trying to navigate their own healing journey, trying to put the war behind them. And now, watching the news, watching this new conflict erupt in Iran, it is, in his exact words, scratching that scab again.
We are talking about the visceral, uncontrollable resurfacing of trauma. And what is vital for our analysis is how this trauma is actively reshaping his political allegiance in real time. King is a loyalist. He voted for Trump in 2016. He voted for him again in 2024.
Right.
But he looks directly at the CNN camera and says he is actively organizing to vote for Democrats in the 2026 midterms. He says the country needs to, quote, send a message.
And his reasoning is so specific and so careful. He makes sure to tell the reporter that he is staunchly pro-military. He is not a pacifist. He believes America has vicious enemies and the homeland needs to be aggressively protected. But he draws a hard, moral line. He says a commander-in-chief, quote, cannot be flippant about war.
That's a strong statement.
For Dale King, the handling of the Iran war was the absolute last straw. After years of wavering on the domestic stuff, the sheer bloody gravity of a new foreign conflict shattered his loyalty. He mentions that he's talking to other veterans in his network, and he feels a massive shift is coming. He believes people are finally starting to see through to the, quote, true core of the president, as opposed to the character he played on the campaign trail.
So CNN utilizes Dale King as the ultimate undeniable proof of their thesis. The coalition is cracking. If you have a 2-time Trump-voting, combat-decorated veteran in a 74% red county actively organizing to slip the district blue because of foreign policy recklessness, that is a political earthquake.
Yeah, that's a huge shift.
But if we pivot back to Vaush's stream and watch his real-time reaction to Dale King, it is explosive.
It is a profound, incredibly uncomfortable cultural clash.
It is. Vaush listens to King's deeply emotional reasoning, watches him talk about his trauma, and then completely viscerally dismisses him. He rejects the entire premise of the CNN interview. He attacks what he aggressively terms the cult of American vettery.
Okay, we need to carefully unpack the mechanics of this clash, because this is a massive third-rail topic in American discourse. CNN is operating within the traditional American paradigm. In this paradigm, born out of the post-WPRI era and heavily reinforced after the cultural fractures of the Vietnam War, society holds immense, almost unquestionable reverence for the veteran perspective.
The cultural agreement is that someone who has shed blood or seen combat has earned a special, elevated moral authority, especially when they are discussing matters of war, peace, and foreign policy.
CNN puts King on camera because his uniform gives his political defection maximum gravity.
Precisely. The uniform acts as a moral multiplier for his opinion. But Vaush views that automatic reverence not as a virtue, but as a dangerous, anti-intellectual societal blind spot. He argues from a position of strict utilitarian political philosophy.
Which means what exactly?
In his view, military service should not afford anyone special political deference, particularly if that specific person has a documented history of supporting policies or candidates that Vaush vehemently opposes.
He refuses to grant amnesty for past votes just because the guy has medals on his wall.
Exactly. Vaush uses highly inflammatory, aggressive language here. He questions why he, as a progressive, should be expected to sit quietly and take seriously a man waxing poetic about the horrors of war and the sanctity of military service when that exact same man willingly walked into a voting booth and voted multiple times for a leader that Vaush categorizes as an existential threat to democracy, or, in his words, a fascist.
Vaush even goes so far as to suggest, with heavy biting sarcasm, that maybe if these veterans are still so inherently pro-military and hawkish, they need to go do another tour of duty in Iran themselves.
It's brutal.
He is entirely unsympathetic to King's PTSD, his trauma, or his current political evolution. To Vaush, the evolution is a decade too late to matter.
When we examine this impartially, we're looking at a massive fracture. It's not just a disagreement between left and right. It is a collision between two fundamentally incompatible value systems. On one side, the traditional belief that lived, agonizing experience in war commands universal respect and inherently validates a change of heart. On the other side, the hyperpolarized belief that a person's voting record is an absolute, permanent moral indictment, and that wearing a uniform does not excuse or erase the damage caused by those past political choices.
How do you weigh a uniform against a ballot? It's a brutal question. Think about how massive abstract geopolitical events filter down to the most localized, granular levels of our society. A cynical maneuver made in a war room in Washington or a drone strike launched in Tehran translates directly, months later, into whether a sheep farmer in Ohio can afford to buy fertilizer or whether a local gym owner in Portsmouth can sleep through the night without a 20-year-old trauma waking him up in a cold sweat.
It's all connected.
And it is these hyperlocal, deeply personal, heavily emotional realities that ultimately decide control of the Senate, not the white papers generated by think tanks.
And this incredible friction between clinging to the rhetoric of the past, dealing with the trauma of the present, and facing a very painful economic future isn't isolated to the state lines of Ohio. To truly understand the depths of this cultural inertia, Vaush argues we have to look slightly east, across the border, into the mountains of West Virginia.
Earlier, we asked the question, if your entire identity is tied to an industry that no longer exists, who do you become when the factory whistle stops blowing? That was the existential crisis haunting the auto workers in Lordstown. But in West Virginia, they aren't just dealing with a closed building. They were dealing with the slow-motion collapse of an entire way of life. Let's look at the mechanics of the coal miner's paradox.
In the middle of his stream, Vaush pulls up a secondary clip. It features a speech given by a current West Virginia state senator. This politician is standing in front of a crowd, explicitly appealing to his core constituency, the coal miners. And the economic data he is forced to cite during the speech is incredibly grim. He notes that 1,000 metallurgical coal jobs have been permanently lost in his district this year alone. On top of that, over 4,000 steam coal jobs have vanished in the surrounding areas.
A total hemorrhage of the local economy. And how does the senator respond to this catastrophic data? Does he offer a retraining program? Does he talk about a transition?
Nope.
No. His response is entirely combative. He tells the crowd that they are victims of a war on coal. He explicitly blames bureaucrats in our state government and environmental regulations for shutting the mines down. And then he makes the grand promise. He vows to fight like hell to reopen those specific mines.
And we have to look at the structural municipal reason why he is making that promise. It's not just rhetoric, it's math. He admits during the speech that the state of West Virginia desperately relies on the severance tax collections from the coal industry to fund their municipal tax cuts and their basic government spending.
Pause right there. Break down the mechanics of a severance tax for the listener, because this is the invisible engine driving this whole paradox.
A severance tax is a specific tax imposed by a state on the extraction of non-renewable natural resources. When a company pulls a ton of coal out of a West Virginia mountain, they pay a tax to the state for severing that resource from the earth.
Makes sense.
In heavily resource-dependent states, this tax doesn't just fund extra projects. It funds the baseline survival of the state. It pays for the police departments, the road paving, the local schools.
So if the coal stays in the ground, the town literally goes bankrupt.
Exactly. So the senator is looking at these miners who are terrified of losing their livelihoods, and he is telling them, stand with me, vote for me, let's fight the bureaucrats, and we will bring the 1950s back to life. He is promising a resurrection.
Vaush's analysis of this speech is a masterclass in progressive cynicism. He pauses the video and just dismantles the senator's rhetoric. Vaush concludes that the senator is purely deeply cynical. He claims the politician doesn't actually believe a single word he is saying about defeating the bureaucrats or reversing global energy markets.
He thinks it's all fake.
Vaush argues the senator secretly, quote, hates his voters, knows perfectly well he is speaking to an undereducated, desperate audience, and is simply using this grievance theater to maintain the status quo so he can continue to enjoy campaign donations and corporate kickbacks from the few remaining coal conglomerates.
Vaush essentially says the politician is weaponizing their economic grief. But what makes this segment so fascinating is that Vaush moves beyond just attacking the politician. He pivots and makes a much broader and frankly far more challenging economic argument about the entire region of Appalachia. He diagnoses the situation in West Virginia as a massive collective failure of imagination.
Yes. This is where Vaush pitches an alternative vision that is radically different from anything the senator is offering. He looks at the geography of West Virginia, the rolling Appalachian Mountains, the incredible natural beauty, the proximity to major East Coast cities, and he asks a genuine question. What does West Virginia have aside from coal? His answer is a massive, untapped service economy just waiting to be built.
He says West Virginia could be the next Colorado.
I want to really look at this pitch, because on paper, it is fascinating. Vaush envisions completely transforming the state. He talks about building modern, metropolitan, highly urbane, densely populated small towns nestled right into the mountainsides. He imagines a regional economy fueled not by extracting black rocks from the dark, but by wealthy people from New York and D.C. driving down for legendary weekend nature hikes.
It's a totally different world.
He's talking about turning West Virginia into a premium ecotourist tech hub. He points out that there is absolutely nothing structurally preventing West Virginia from transitioning into a robust, high-wage, service-based tech economy, much like neighboring Virginia has successfully done in areas like Charlottesville or the Dulles Corridor.
It is a vision of total economic reinvention.
Let's play this out. I want to put this to you. Let's look at Vaush's pitch objectively. He is saying to a community, stop sending your sons into a dark, dangerous, lung-destroying, collapsing coal mine. Instead, come build a sunny, lucrative eco-tourist tech hub. Open a boutique hotel. Serve artisanal pour-over coffee to wealthy hikers who will tip you 20%.
It sounds great, logically.
On a pure spreadsheet, looking at life expectancy, workplace safety, and potential profit margins, that sounds like a massive, undeniable upgrade in quality of life. So my question is, why doesn't that pitch work? Why do these voters passionately cheer for the guy promising to send them back into the dark mine and actively hate the guy offering them the sunny tech hub?
To understand this, we have to completely abandon the spreadsheet and impartially contextualize the human element of economics. Vaush calls it a reliance on grief and a stubborn refusal to adapt. But think about how profoundly psychologically violent it is to tell an entire community to abandon its multi-generational identity.
Explain that. How is a tech hub violent?
It's cultural violence. Think about the sociology of a mining town. If your great-grandfather was a miner and your grandfather died of black lung and your father was a union miner and your high school mascot is literally the miner, your entire communal value system, your definition of masculinity, and your concept of worth is built on physical sacrifice, danger, and extracting tangible power from the earth.
It's the semiotics of labor again. The soot on the face is a badge of honor.
Precisely. Telling that deeply proud community to suddenly become eco-tourist guides or barista owners or tech support workers for wealthy out-of-towners isn't just asking them to change jobs, it is demanding a total cultural erasure.
That's a huge ask.
It feels profoundly insulting to them. When the state senator stands up and promises to reopen the mine, he isn't just promising a paycheck, he is validating their heritage. He is telling them their bloodline matters. When an outsider like Vaush tells them to become the next Colorado, he's essentially telling them that their entire heritage is obsolete, useless, and needs to be paved over for a bike trail.
It is the ultimate battle between a spreadsheet economy and an identity economy. The spreadsheet says global coal prices are down, transition to service. Identity says we are coal. Without coal, we are nothing. And as Vaush points out with immense, palpable frustration on his stream, identity almost always wins. He argues that they insist on dying in the coal mines because they literally cannot fathom, cannot imagine any other version of themselves.
So we have identified several massive, conflicting, powerful forces at play in this landscape. We have an incredibly deep, stubborn, emotional attachment to the past as seen in West Virginia. We have a charisma void, where loud voices and aggressive posturing completely outcompete technocratic data and policy. We have shifting macroeconomic realities and idle factories in places like Lordstown.
So the ultimate question is, when you take all of these highly volatile elements, the vanished red hats in the Mahoning Valley, the 4,460 unemployed battery workers, the traumatized gym owner flipping his vote, and the West Virginia coal miners demanding their mines back, when you look at all of these localized realities, what does the resulting national map actually look like?
This brings us to our final and perhaps most complex section, the midterm map and the terrifying math of the generational tax burden.
Let's pull back from the micro and go to the macro. We return to the CNN anchor desk in the studio. They pull up the massive digital map of Ohio from the 2024 presidential election, and the visual is staggering. It is overwhelmingly red.
A sea of red.
The incumbent won 81 out of 88 counties in the state. CNN's own data analyst stands at the screen and explicitly warns the audience, look at this map and be highly skeptical about Democratic chances. It looks like an impenetrable wall of red.
It looks permanent. However, CNN's analyst immediately points out the hidden vulnerability in that wall. They dive into the localized inflation data and note that in more than half of those 88 deep red counties, a highly critical economic threshold has recently been crossed.
Close to the threshold.
The basic costs of survival energy, housing, and groceries are currently running significantly ahead of wage growth.
This is the purest distillation of traditional kitchen table economics. CNN operates on the deeply held journalistic theory that if inflation outpaces your paycheck, eventually gravity takes over. The theory assumes that a voter will eventually look at their grocery receipt, realize they can't afford milk, and vote against the incumbent party, regardless of their cultural identity or how much they like the politician's charisma.
They believe high prices equal flipped votes. Period.
That is why Chris Anderson and CNN think 2026 is going to be a bloodbath for the Republicans.
But Vaush, sitting in his studio looking at the exact same electoral map and the exact same crippling inflation data, remains intensely, unshakably skeptical of CNN's traditional theory. He simply does not believe that these specific voters will flip their allegiance based on the price of a gallon of milk.
Because he thinks the cultural gravity is stronger than the economic gravity.
Exactly. He argues that the right-wing populist base is primarily motivated by deep-seated cultural grievances, what he repeatedly terms spite and racial animus. His prediction is grimly confident.
What does he predict?
The moment they get pitched another shiny, aggressive cultural project by a charismatic Republican, they are going to forget about the price of groceries and jump right back on board. He thinks the Democrats' hope for a rational, math-based voter rebellion is a complete mirage.
Okay, but this is where Vauch introduces a massive contradiction that I need you to explain. He says the base is totally loyal and will never leave. But then, almost in the same breath, he warns that the Republican Party is, in his exact words, sleepwalking into oblivion. How can they be sleepwalking into oblivion if he just established that their base will blindly follow them anywhere?
Because eventually the cultural messaging collides with the underlying municipal math. Vaush argues that while the populist right completely dominates the emotional and cultural messaging in these rural areas, winning election after election, they have absolutely no functional technocratic plan for fixing the underlying economic decay. And here is the brutal reality of local government. You cannot run a state purely on cultural grievance indefinitely if the actual tax base physically collapses.
You can't pay for the police department with a speech about the border.
Precisely. And this leads to one of the most striking, speculative, and frankly fascinating macroeconomic claims Vaush makes in his entire stream. He looks at the slow-motion economic decay of these regions, the lost manufacturing plants in Lordstown, the dying coal towns in West Virginia, the aging populations, and he extrapolates a terrifying dystopian future regarding the American tax burden.
Break this down. This is the narrowing tax demographic theory.
Yes, Vaush predicts a drastically narrowing tax demographic. Let's walk through the math of a dying town. The factory closes. That means the corporate tax revenue hits zero. The 1,400 workers lose their jobs, so the local income tax revenue plummets.
Right.
The young people, realizing there are no jobs, pack up their cars and move to Chicago or New York. The people who stay are older, often retiring and transitioning onto fixed incomes or Social Security, which aren't taxed at high rates. But the town's expenses don't drop.
No, the roads still need to be paved.
The water treatment plant still needs to run. The pensions for the retired firefighters still need to be paid.
So the financial burden gets heavier, but the number of people carrying it gets smaller.
Exactly. And Vaush extrapolates this local dynamic to the entire national scale. He says, if these trends continue, if rural areas refuse to adapt their economies and continue to hemorrhage young talent, eventually the margins of the taxable demographic will shrink so drastically that the entire burden of funding the United States government will fall on a tiny, hyper-specific slice of the population.
And who is left holding the bag in his scenario?
He describes them as 18 to 35-year-old, renting, urban young professionals making between $50,000 and $100,000 a year who have chosen not to have children.
The dinks. Double income, no kids. Or even single income, no kids.
Exactly. The young, urban, service economy workers. Vaush argues that because the rural, grievance-driven economies are failing to transition, and because massive corporate wealth is consolidating at the very top and utilizing tax loopholes, this highly specific demographic of young, childless, urban professionals will effectively become the only group left generating a taxable surplus. He looks directly into his camera, addressing this demographic in his audience, and says, "You will single-handedly fund the entire nation."
It's a terrifying mathematical projection. So let's zoom out and look at this massive collision course we've uncovered today. We're looking at two entirely different realities trying to occupy the exact same map of Ohio. On one hand, CNN's traditional institutional journalism suggests that standard, reliable metrics crippling inflation, 1,460 lost factory jobs, the profound psychological exhaustion of the Iran war are slowly, steadily, rationally chipping away at this populist coalition.
They see a system that is fundamentally rational. The reaction is just delayed.
But on the other hand, Vaush suggests those traditional metrics are almost entirely irrelevant to the actual voters. He believes that until the Democratic Party stops being quiet, boring technocrats and starts playing the blood sport of politics with actual aggressive charisma, the underlying culture war will keep that map entirely red. He sees a system driven purely by emotion, historical identity, and noise.
So different.
I want you to think about your own town for a second. Think about your local city council, or your school board, or your state representatives. When it comes time to make a critical decision about zoning or budgets or school curriculums, are those decisions being made based on data, spreadsheets, and long-term economic forecasts? Are you living in a technocracy? Or are those local decisions being driven by historical grievances, cultural identity, and pure, raw emotion? Which invisible force is actually steering the ship where you live? The spreadsheet or the identity?
It is the defining question of modern local governance across the country, not just in Ohio.
We have covered an immense, staggering amount of ground today. We started our journey looking for the missing red Magaya hats in the grocery stores of the Mahoning Valley, trying to deduce if the silence of the voter meant a change of heart or just a retreat to the couch. We stood outside the locked gates of the idle Altium electric vehicle factories in Lordstown, measuring the devastating weight of 1,460 lost paychecks against the macro promise of protective tariffs and the deeply ingrained semiotics of the American worker.
We visited an isolated sheep farm shielded from global conflict and a veteran's gym deeply, painfully scarred by it, highlighting the profound, unpredictable differences in how massive geopolitical shockwaves actually hit the American home front.
And we descended into the dark psychological depths of the West Virginia coal paradox, examining the terrifying friction between an economic spreadsheet that coldly demands adaptation and a cultural identity that fiercely refuses to die.
If we have to synthesize a final overarching insight from all of this complexity, it is fascinating to note where our two wildly different sources actually align.
Yeah, they do agree on something.
Despite their immense, almost insurmountable ideological differences, both the CNN reporters and the progressive streamer Vaush actually agree on the fundamental physical reality on the ground. Both sources agree that the massive economic promises made to these rural voters have simply not materialized. The factories aren't booming, the healthcare isn't fixed, the debt isn't lower.
The reality is agreed upon. The divergence is purely on the psychology of the aftermath. CNN believes the voters will eventually care about the broken promises and will rationally punish the politicians who broke them. Vaush believes the voters don't care about the promises at all, only the emotional posture, and that the technocratic opponents are simply too uncharismatic to capitalize on the failure anyway.
It boils down to a debate over human nature. Is the American voter ultimately a rational consumer of policies or an emotional consumer of narratives?
Which brings me back to that initial image we started with. We talked so much today about massive industries attempting to transition. We talked about the brutal friction of transitioning from deep, dangerous coal mines to sunny, service-based ecotourism in Colorado-style hubs. We talked about the stuttering transition from gas-powered General Motors combustion engines to Altium electric vehicle batteries.
All of those are technological, infrastructural, and economic transitions. They're hard, but they're logistical problems.
Right. Logistical problems have logistical solutions. But I want to leave you, the listener, with a final lingering question to ponder on your own tonight. What if the hardest transition a society faces isn't technological? What if it isn't economic? What if the absolute hardest thing to transition in the world is a community's core identity? We can pour concrete and build a new factory. We can write a grant to train a coal miner to use new software. But their entire self-worth, your concept of masculinity, your family history, and your multi-generational pride is inextricably tied to an industry that the global economy simply no longer needs. Who do you become when the factory whistle finally stops blowing? Do you embrace the terrifying, emasculating unknown of the future? Or do you vote for the loudest, most charismatic person in the room promising to turn back the clock?
That is the ultimate fracture point of the American electorate.
Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly dense, challenging deep dive. Keep looking past the headlines, keep questioning the mechanics and the narratives around you, and we will see you next time.